Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello and welcome to episode 351 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Today's episode, I am just turning on the mic and talking. Why? Well, let me explain a few things. If you can't hear it in my voice, I'm a little under the weather. It has been a pretty stacked and intense week of stuff to do, and I've got an even busier week coming up next week that includes some travel for some speaking engagements with my local hometown libraries, two different branches. And yesterday I had to go to the doctor. My doctor managed to fit me in last minute. I've had excruciating pain in my throat for 4 days, and I thought it would go away. I went to bed, got lots of rest, tried to do everything I could to treat it, and obviously you can't get rid of strep throat without some additional support. I'm whipped. I'm completely tired. I'm behind in getting the podcast out. But despite all of the things and the deadlines, and there's so many other things I have to get done, and it's already later in the day on Friday, and all I really want to do is go to bed. But instead, I'm sitting here, and I turned on the microphone. And I want to explore why. Oh, I should also let you know, it's just going to be me and the microphone. There's not going to be any ad read. There's not going to be, well, the whole thing's a personal update, etc., etc. Just going to be basically a relatively shorter episode of just me reflecting. Why? Why am I doing this? Why do I feel it's important to get this episode out, despite the fact that all I really want to do is crawl into bed and go to sleep? There's something about the consistency of, I have not missed a week of this podcast in the 7 years since I started. I'm in the 7th year, so I started, January of 2018, I think. Maybe I'm in the 6th year, or did I start in 2017? I can't remember. I can't do the math right now, but from when I started the podcast, I have not missed a single week. And call it a superstition, but regardless of what's been going on in my life, I've never not missed a week. And that's important to me. That continuation is important to me. There's an old story about Seinfeld writing a joke a day for whatever, and just being on track and being on track with that, and never breaking that rhythm, never breaking that pattern. And I'm a bit of a completionist, and I get this way with certain things where I want to complete things, I want to finish things, whatever. That's a part of who I am. It's a part of my nature. And so the fact that I haven't yet missed a Friday, even though, I'll be honest with you, it takes 3 or 4 or 5 hours for me to produce an episode of the podcast, because I don't want to just slap an episode together. I know I'm slapping one together now. But when I have a guest that I interview, I want to give it the care and attention that my guests deserve and need. And for me, because that's the way I've decided to do this podcast, is I edit the podcast myself. I go in and I cut out the ums and ahs and stuff like that. And I re-listen to the interview, because here's the thing. I brought someone on my podcast so I could talk to them, so I could learn from them, so that you could learn from them as well. I need, I need to re-listen to it to remind myself of the awesomeness of my guest. And I need to be in a space where I can actually attend to what they're doing and saying, not to just kind of rush through it. Which is why I'm just turning the mic on and doing this episode, because if I were to do an episode with this haste and less planning, I would be doing a disservice to my guest, and I never want to do that. I want my guests to be the star. I want them to be the important element of that episode. Yeah, of course, I've got the pre and the post matter and the reflections, but it just doesn't feel right. Just like it doesn't feel right not to release an episode, even if it's a shorter episode, even if it's an episode of me just randomly reflecting on things. Okay, so admittedly, I feel really bad. I'm feverish. I'm achy. I've done a couple of live streams today. I did one last night, and they were all fun and amazing. But as I got to the point where I needed to do this thing for myself, I'm drained, and I just don't have any energy in me at all. But being on a roll is important. Continuing to have the weekly podcast is important. Maybe because that's one of the ways that I've defined myself, and I want to be true to myself. Have you ever found yourself in situations where you want to be true to yourself, and that puts you in a weird situation? Maybe you understand why it is that I'm doing that. But the other thing is, why would I even bother turning on the microphone and randomly babbling potential nonsense? Between coughing fits, of course. And put myself in that awkward, weird position. I think it's a reminder that we don't always, the things we see publicly are not always the stuff that people are struggling with in dealing with behind the scenes that they don't reveal. Most of the time, no matter what I've been going through in my life, and I'm pretty honest with my listeners, I'm pretty, my personal updates, I talk about difficult weeks and stuff like that. But for the most part, I turn on the personality that I need to be for the podcast to provide that value for my podcast listeners. But I think it's also important to kind of show the warts and show a little bit of the behind the scenes for a couple reasons. A reminder that we all have our warts. A reminder that there's always the things that we personally struggle with that other people never see. Why am I harping on that? I'm wanting to remind myself to be more compassionate with other people, to treat other people with just a little bit more patience. Because who knows? Who knows what they might be going through that we don't see? I think it's important for us to remember that. And one of the reasons I'm sharing that with you is to remind you that that's potentially the case when people that you interact with and encounter. Wow, this is really difficult because I've either stopped the recording numerous times or I've just gone into coughing spasms, which I will edit and cut out of this. So I didn't just turn on the mic and go. I will still edit some of the things out of it, especially the coughing fits. You don't need to hear me get into a coughing fit, but again, that's part of one of the core things that I want to do with the podcast is And that's where the Stark part of the Stark Reflections comes from. It's not just the brand name. It's not just the company that I founded and registered back in 2004. It's just wanting to share that reality of the world to you, the good and the bad and the ugly. I tend to focus most on the good and the positive, but I do think it's important for us to acknowledge some of those darker things, some of those moments where we just don't feel like putting on that public persona. And maybe that should be a time where I should say, nah, let's not record an episode. Let's just hide and we'll put on the happy, shiny face. But I think potentially there's somebody out there who feels less about themselves because they think, oh, nobody else deals with this. Nobody else has to deal with that. And maybe they feel that they're the only one who's like that. So potentially by me sharing this with you in this way, it helps you see none of us are perfect. We have flaws. We make mistakes. We make errors. I guess that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have our works edited, reviewed by other people so we can fix things. Can you hear my voice kind of go as it begins to mellow out? I'm probably going to pause, cough, clear my throat a little bit, and then I'll begin to speak a little bit better, a little bit more clearly. So I've got some deadlines. I've got some things to do. I am on antibiotics, and I have a great doctor. I went in to visit the doctor, and good news, she said, is after 48 hours of being on the antibiotics, I will no longer be contagious to anyone else, which is really good because I have to go do a couple public talks at libraries, and the last thing I want to do is spread the bugs, spread the virus, this strep throat, which is just nasty. I have to tell you, the absolute anguish I feel when I swallow is it's excruciating. It's really nasty, and it doesn't matter how many painkillers I take. It just dulls it a little bit. It makes it tolerable, but it's still pain. It was kind of funny as I was tossing and turning in a feverish haze last night, and every time I swallowed, just like wincing painfully, I kept thinking about, well, what if the pain was somewhere else in my body? Would it be easier to deal with? I always think about stuff like that. Migraine's one of the ones that's the most difficult. I've only had a handful of those in my life, but they can be so debilitating, just absolutely debilitating, because it's right at the center of your being, your mind, of who you are. At least with my throat, it may be attached to my head, but it's not that same thing. I remember having pain from my hernia, and that's a different kind of pain that's localized in a very specific region. Sure, can't do much, especially when the pain is so excruciating you can barely stand. But at least it's sort of not isolated, but it's in a different part of your body. Things to think about. When you're in pain, you're trying to wonder what it might be like. Well, what if my arm was sore instead? And I don't think there's any right answer to that. It's just one of the things I think of as I'm laying there in my feverish haze and wondering how much sleep I'm actually getting as I toss and I turn. And of course, last night as I was tossing and turning and worrying about all the things that I had to get done, for today, that I had to get the podcast out the door, and even the things I have to plan for next week that I still have to work on. Those are the things that kept me up at night. So I resolved somewhere in the middle of the feverish haze to just be honest with you, dear podcast listener, and put on the mic and just record a very short episode, doing two things, acknowledging the reality that it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and we go through some dark patches, but also that importance or that value of being on a roll and having that continuous weekly podcast. That was important to me. Even if it's shorter, and even if it's a little bit incoherent as I'm babbling, I realize. But I babble all the time. If you're listening to the podcast, you're probably used to it. So all that is to say is I'm here again, like I am every week. I want to return next week with one of the interviews from one of the awesome people I was fortunate enough to get a chance to talk to, and then I get to share and relay that with you. And I thank you for listening to the podcast, listening to my meandering musings of a feverish mind, let's say. So, I know I'm going to be feeling better shortly as the antibiotics continue to kick in, and maybe I can just go have a quick nap before I tackle some of the other things I have to get done. But I will be back next week in better form with a better voice. And so, until next week and until next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.